Yay, I'm so excited to see you all. I always feel kind of emotional when I see the number of people joining some of these spaces. So to see kind of the number going up and up to around 80 parents and folks on this group tonight just always makes me really happy. So I'm excited to be here with you all tonight. We wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the holidays, both as a chance to share some of our kind of tips and things that we've seen over the years with families. And then we will have some time at the end for Q&A and discussion together. And I'm going to really try to talk slower for the interpreters. So interpreters, just let me know if I'm talking too fast. And before we get started, I just wanted to let folks know about the recording piece. So we are going to record the content, this portion of the group tonight, just mostly these slides, because there were quite a few people who couldn't join in real time and wanted the information. So I know typically we don't record in groups, but we are going to record just the section on kind of the slides and information, and then we won't we won't send out like the personal sort of discussion space in the second half of the group tonight. And I'm also excited to be joined by Lily and Naomi here. I've asked them to chime in if there's anything they want to add as we go through some of these slides, and then they will be helping out with the Q&A and sort of discussion portion of the second half of the session together. Okay, so we're going to be talking about tips and tricks for navigating the holidays. A little bit about me. I know some of you, I saw some familiar faces, but a lot of you may not know me. My name's Jenna Redmond. I use they and she pronouns. I've been at Gender Spectrum for about 5-6 years. I'm the director of online education. I identify as non-binary and queer. So those are some of the sort of perspectives and experiences that I bring into this space. And I'm also a parent to a 3-year-old. So it's kind of like some of my, some of the frameworks that I use. And these are kind of some of my favorite spaces to get to be in. I love having space where we get to kind of like learn together, but then also have time to kind of connect as a group and build community. So I'm looking forward to getting to spend a little bit of time with you all tonight. And these are some photos of me as a child. I was saying to my coworkers that I asked my mom for a picture of me from the holidays, but I asked too late and stressed her out. So these are just some pictures of me as a child, my family. Okay, so a little bit just to run through what we're going to talk about for a little bit. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about some tips we have for pre-holiday planning. Part of why we wanted to really push to do this session now was so that you all would have some time as sort of we go into the holiday season to plan a little bit. We're going to talk about some things to consider, a little bit about what to do during holiday time and then afterwards. And then we'll take a quick break, and then we all will come back together for sort of a Q&A time. And then hopefully some folks will be feeling brave to share maybe some of the things that you're thinking about for the holidays, and we can kind of work together to talk through some of that as a group. Okay, so a few reminders as we kind of start talking about this. One thing is definitely that the age of your child makes a big difference in some of these slides we're going to talk about. I know we have people on this group that might have really young kids and then have teenagers. So just keeping in mind that the ways that you might approach some of this, right, is going to vary based on if you have a teen or a preteen or a toddler, and what their needs might be will look a little bit different. I also just wanted to name that the holidays are different for everyone, right? Some people might be celebrating holidays in November, December. Some people may not, based on like the cultures that you're in, traditions, race, the faith spaces that you might be in, right? The holidays are going to look different for each of us for different reasons. And then I also know that in terms of COVID, that is something that is impacting a lot of families, especially as we think about coming together for maybe what might be the first time in a couple of years, right? And so the range of kind of what that might look like for your family and your kid might vary depending on how their gender has been impacted by COVID, right? I know that we have quite a few folks whose kids might have not really been talking about gender, exploring their gender pre-COVID, maybe they did during the pandemic, and you might be like seeing family for the first time in a while. We have some folks where maybe that's not their experience. So just keeping that in mind that there might be a range with that. I also just wanted to name that one of my fears with putting these slides together was that the takeaway would be like, oh my gosh, all the holiday time is just going to be doom and gloom. And I just want to name that that's not necessarily true, but we did want to focus on the things that are going to come up that might be challenging versus all of the many things that will probably come up that will be positive and fun. So I just wanted to name that. And also that, you know, some of these slides may resonate with you, some may not. I kind of look at it as like a buffet, right? You're picking the things that you're like, this feels relevant to me and my kid and my family, and some of it may not. So just keeping that in mind as well. And we will have time at the end for questions. I can't really see the chat while I have the slides up, but feel free to put your questions in the chat if you want, and then we'll do our best to get to them at the end. Okay, so I wanted to start with just naming some of the reasons why the holidays can be challenging, especially for gender expansive youth and their parents, caregivers, or the people in their lives supporting them. I think one of the big ones is that many people are interacting with folks that you may not see regularly. So that could be family, that could be friends, it might be your faith community. I know sometimes for me growing up, the holidays was like, there could be friends of a family member there, right? Or people that are like by extension that you don't have necessarily a strong relationship with. So that can be challenging, I think, when we're thinking about gender and how that interacts with family dynamics. I think also in general, the holidays can just bring up a lot of expectations and pressure, even if you were not putting gender into the mix at all. So if folks are feeling maybe anxious or stressed, or are feeling stressed, but maybe they don't even know why, I think just want to validate that that's a very real experience. I think there's another piece too, especially for parents and caregivers, that the holidays can often bring up like conflict and sort of tension between supporting your child's needs around being accepted and affirmed, and also the relationships that you have as an adult with the people in your life. Sometimes the expectations we might have for showing up and affirming your child may not be perfectly meshed with maybe the relationships you have with other people and their understanding of gender, getting on the same page with you around how you want people to show up for your kid. And I think that can often cause a lot of tension and stress. I think there's also a level of like maybe unpredictableness or things that come up around the holidays. Like we were talking about how often holiday gatherings may include alcohol, or maybe just like activities or things that are not typical to sort of like day-to-day life. And so that can often bring up stuff for families and for youth. And then, as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, there's just a lot of holiday traditions that are very gendered. And I think often we maybe don't even think about it until either we ourselves are navigating gender or we have someone close to us that's navigating gender. So we're going to talk about some things around things like decorations, gift giving, expectations around clothing. There's just a lot of things that during the holiday time come up for a lot of young people, and therefore probably come up for a lot of parents as well. Okay, so the two kind of key takeaways that we're going to focus on in this conversation, one is how important it is to have a plan ahead of time that's really thought through with whoever the caregiver or caregivers are and the child. What we say to the youth is like, when you're stressed or you're in a situation that might increase anxiety, like that is not the time to come up with your support plan. You want to have that plan, have like already had that plan in place, so that when those moments come up that are challenging, you've already kind of thought about it. You have some ideas of what to do. So we're going to talk a little bit about planning ahead and what that can look like. And then also, the other key takeaway is really checking in with your child about their expectations and boundaries before, during, and after the holidays. Because so much of like us showing up as parents, I feel like, is also knowing what our child feels comfortable with and what they need. And it's really hard to do that, I think, if we haven't had some like somewhat direct conversations with them beforehand about what that looks like. So those are the two things we're going to kind of focus on. Okay, so most of the time I want to talk about the bulk of, I feel like, what is helpful during the holidays, and that's planning beforehand. So we sort of called this like our pre-holiday planning. And as different situations unfold, it's not always easy to know how or if to help your child. And I think especially around topics with gender and potentially being around people or in spaces that you're not always in, it can feel confusing sometimes to know, like, does my kid want me to step in? Should I say something? Is that going to make it worse? Is it going to make it better? I think that can often be a place of challenge during the holiday time. I think another one to think about is sort of, as the parent, what are your boundaries and expectations with extended family and community and how they interact with your child? Because ultimately, like, as parents and adults, we have a lot of power in that, right? And so for us too, thinking ahead of time, like, what are my like expectations of the people around my kid, and are there things that are like off limits for me in terms of behavior? Are there things that are I can deal with, I can do, like, just kind of checking in with yourself as well. And just again reiterating, like, having that plan and sort of conversations ahead of time, I think, can really alleviate some of the stress that comes with the holiday time. Okay, so again, I want to reiterate, not all of these things in this list are necessarily things that are going to be relevant to each of you, but these are just some of we wanted to break down some of the common things that come up during the holidays and just pose some questions of how you might be able to talk with your child about some of this beforehand. So one big one that I'm sure a lot of folks have been probably already thinking about is name and pronouns. Some questions that you can ask your child are like, what name and pronouns do you want me to use? Is it different depending on like what people are in the space? Do you want me to correct people if they use the wrong ones? I feel like that's really important. And no kid and no family is the same. There might be one kid who's like, someone uses the wrong pronouns, I don't want you to say anything. It's just too much to put, like, it's too much pressure and spotlight on me. And then there might be another kid who's like, yes, absolutely say something. I don't feel comfortable doing that, but I would love if you would. So I think really just having that conversation before. And I know, like, sometimes too, there's situations where a child might be using a different name at home than they're maybe using with, like, feel comfortable using with extended family. And so just even talking about that, like, what does that look like for all of us? What are their expectations of family members during that time? So I think the name and pronouns one is important, and that can come up for a lot of families. Another one, which I can definitely relate to as a child, is expectations around like clothing, and how that might impact your child's like gender expression. I think the holidays are often like, maybe there's more times where you're dressing up, there's more formal clothing. For me, I was raised Catholic, so we went to church during holiday time. There's just like a lot of outfits that needed to be planned. And that was a really hard time for me around my gender, because I often felt like the outfits that felt good to me were not acceptable at that time to really be wearing. And so I think that's another one to really plan ahead with your child around what they want to wear, what you feel comfortable with them wearing, and just like talking it through beforehand. Because I think the piece that can be so stressful is if everyone waits till the last minute and then it's like a meltdown because of all the pressure around it. And often I think the holiday time too, for a lot of young people, can really increase their gender dysphoria. And part of that might be from like not being able to wear the clothing they want, or if they're in a space where they know people are not going to use their correct pronouns or their name, like all these little things that might come up for a young person where they're not really being seen for how they feel and for who they are, can really increase those feelings of gender dysphoria. And that's often why for a lot of young people, we hear them say like they have more anxiety during the holidays, or maybe they feel a little more depressed or worried. So just keeping that in mind and talking about it as much as is realistically possible beforehand, I think can help. Another one we put on here, which I actually forgot and then thought about it kind of last minute, is the piece around decorations. So this can come up a lot for families if maybe you have a child who's changed their name and you have like old stockings or old ornaments or things with pictures on them or things on there. And so just thinking ahead around, can you make changes to more reflect where your child is at or what would feel good for them? And for some kids, that might be fine to have things that are like old photos and stuff like that. For other kids, it might not. So just that can be one that's worth checking in about. I think it can also be really powerful if you know that you might be in spaces during the holidays where like you're around family who just maybe aren't going to get it, or they're new to interacting with your child at home, you have the ability to like create these affirming spaces for them. And so something as small as like having their name on an ornament, or if you do gift giving, like having the name that they use on the tag for the gifts, like just things to show that you see them for who they are, I think that can be really, really helpful. And so something often like we don't think about until the moment, and then sometimes it's too late, right, to make some of those changes. And then with that, I think along those lines is also around gift giving. We hear from a lot of young people like that they'll have some really strong positive memory of getting a gift that affirms their gender. Maybe it's like a toy that they feel like speaks to being more feminine, or a piece of clothing that's just like makes them feel really excited as like the person sees them. So I think it can be really positive, and it can be a stressful time, especially when like I already feel stressed opening gifts in front of people, right? Because you don't know like how to respond, how do you act excited, and if a child gets a gift that maybe really doesn't affirm their gender, that can also bring up feelings for them. So that can be something to think about too. Maybe asking your child, like, what are some gifts you're interested in for the holidays? Is there anything you don't want? Sometimes we'll have teens who just say they want like gift cards, so they don't have to kind of like hold the anxiety around opening gifts. But I think on the flip side, if you have people in your life that are really supporting your kid, and they're willing to get like maybe some sort of gift that's really going to mean a lot, that I know is great too. We have heard so many stories in our grandparents group of grandparents getting gifts like for their grandkid that like affirms their gender, and just how much that's like bonded their relationship. So I think that can also be a moment for like a lot of positive memories and connection as well. Okay, and then two other things I added here, which I think depending on the age, but most kids I think could kind of conceptualize this, is also just talking about questions that your child does not feel okay answering or talking about. Because that's can really range from kid to kid, right? Some like gender expansive youth want to talk about their gender, right? They're excited about it. Maybe they want to talk about their name or something around their gender journey. And then some kids may feel like that's just absolutely too much for them, and that's not something they're interested in. So we have kind of added here questions that are not okay to ask, and then questions that are okay to ask. And I think that's helpful for parents too, because in the moment, if something comes up, hopefully you all have talked about it enough that like, oh, this question just came up around my child, for example, like being on blockers or changing their pronouns, and I know they're not comfortable answering that, then you kind of already know to step in and say something, versus maybe something else comes up and maybe you assumed like they're not going to be comfortable answering that, but you all have already had the conversation and you know that they're okay with that question being asked. And obviously these things are not going to cover everything or solve all of it, but I think often we hear after the holidays like parents and youth being like, oh, I wish I had talked about this beforehand. I wish we had kind of had a little bit of a plan. Like I didn't know what to do. And then it was so stressful that I couldn't communicate my needs in the moment. So those are just some of the things that I think are the most common that come up. And when we get to the discussion time, I'm curious to hear from folks. I'm sure there are other things too that families are thinking about. Okay, and then one reminder we wanted to add is that, not all communication with your child needs to be an in-person conversation or happen all at once, right? These are like really big topics, right? To be like, what name and pronouns do you want to use? What clothes do you want to wear for the holidays? Like all this stuff is like, can often feel heavy and overwhelming. And so one thing we just wanted to remind folks is that it may not be that you go through all of that at once, right? Maybe it's like you're kind of throwing in different topics at different times. And also just thinking about what approach will work best for your child, depending on their age, their comfort in talking about their gender. Is that like texting your teen, asking them these questions, or maybe it's like having them type out the answers and not even having a full conversation about it. It might be a one-on-one conversation. I think that does work for some youth. And maybe for younger kids, it's like, through play or an activity where you're kind of, helping them sort of think about and anticipate some of the things that might come up and just having a plan ahead of time. We're doing a similar kind of conversation with the teens at our teen group next week. And so we're kind of flipping them this question on them too, of like, you may not feel comfortable communicating all of these things to your parent, but like, let's try to figure out the way that feels most comfortable. And that might be just like texting and then never talking about it again. But we just wanted to remind folks that, and that you might not be able to get through all of this in one sitting. And then the other piece with all of this is kind of thinking about, once you've sort of figured out what your child needs, how they're feeling and where they're at around the holidays, is figuring out, are there things I need to communicate to other people? And so I think that can be a little bit complex because often we have different relationships with different family members and extended community in different ways. And so there might be things that you feel are appropriate to share with certain family members and not others. So just thinking through, some of the questions we put on here are like, for anyone who you wish to communicate with about your child's gender, what do you want them to know or to do? Who will tell them and how will that communication be handled? I'll send this in the follow-up email, but we do have like a link on our website that has some examples of ways to communicate with friends and family. And then another piece is like, if there'll be people attending an event that have never met your child, just thinking through like, can you communicate with the host or other people about how you want them to communicate with your child, or do you want to give them a heads up about anything? And then we just bolded at the end, always checking in with your child about what their preference is for communicating with others, because I think the last thing we want to do is like, it's tricky, right? Because you want to communicate this stuff, but you don't want to over communicate it and share things that your child isn't comfortable with. So I think that's where kind of the pre-planning comes in. The more you can have some of those conversations, the more you can understand, okay, how do I create this affirming space that my child's envisioning and wants? It might not be fully possible, right? And does that then require me to communicate with other people? Okay, so that's the bulk of it. During the holiday time, the few things we put in here, one is around checking in. If you can find ways, even if things seem to be going well, to just check in with your child during like a gathering or time together, just to see how they're doing. Taking breaks. So often we hear from young people that they're like, I wish I just could have taken like a 10-minute break from the dinner or from hanging out. I just needed some time. So thinking about if there are ways where you can like take a walk, sitting in the car, just doing things to sort of be able to check in with them and give them a little bit of time to decompress. We also have on here, like, you might want to consider, hopefully this doesn't happen for anyone, but like, what would be your boundaries around leaving an activity or leaving a gathering? That's not to say that's going to happen or is needed, but sometimes we have families who are in a situation where they're like, I wish we had talked ahead of time about kind of what our line is for maybe like participating and staying around family or community, or just simply leaving. So just thinking about that too. Hopefully that's not something that comes up for folks, but sometimes it can be. And then lastly, just seeking support. I think that often for youth, the holidays can be hard, but also for sure for families and caregivers and parents. So, thinking about if you can call a friend, coming to the gender spectrum group. I know we have one, I think December, maybe. I don't know. Lily knows. But just like having spaces where you can debrief and check in, where that people are going to understand some of the unique sort of dynamics and things that you're thinking about. And then after the holiday time, checking in with your child following the event doesn't need to be right away. But I think often the stuff that comes up around the holidays is not necessarily limited to the holidays, right? It's like this condensed version, but it can be really helpful to kind of identify like what moments were difficult, what moments were positive, were there things that like they wish that you had done differently, just to use that time to like really gather information for sort of future things that you'll be navigating together. Following up with individuals if needed. And then the last one is just so important. I want to reiterate like self-care for parents and caregivers. Like even as I'm going through these slides, I'm like, there's a lot that you all are holding and thinking about and planning for and anticipating. And it's really important that you also take care of yourself, right, during this time and after. So don't want to stress that enough, that that's also really important. Okay, let me check time. I think we're gonna take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back together and we're gonna open it up to the group for questions. And then we'll also have a chance for folks to share things that you're thinking about for the holidays, and we'll kind of do some planning and support together. So you can just use this time to do whatever you need to do and think of some questions so that we can talk about them all together in a few minutes.